Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to another Zien and ESOP Centre webinar with David Craddock. This one being on levelling up and social mobility employee share schemes. Just a very quick word from me. I'm the Managing Director of the Zien Group Limited, and I will just introduce today's session. The first thing that I want to say is a big thank you to our members and sponsors. These are the ESOP Centre members, and without the membership and forbearance of our members and sponsors, we wouldn't be able to do this webinar programme or indeed much else. So we really are grateful to all of these individuals and organisations for their membership and sponsorship. And likewise, ESOP Centre is part of a large grouping called FS Club. And these are all the members of FS Club. And again, we're grateful to all of these wonderful organisations, large and small, and some individuals who sponsor and join us to enable us to do a very broad-based webinar programme. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. I hope to take up no more than 5 minutes of your time, maybe even a little bit less, with my introductions, and then hand you over to David Craddock for the keynote presentation. We usually find the keynote presentation takes about 20-25 minutes, and that leaves bags of time for questions and answers. And the feedback that we have from people is that the questions and answers is one of the bits of our program that people like the best. So please do chime in with your questions. We really do want them. David loves answering questions. In order to do that, please use the questions box in your GoToWebinar control panel. We are insulated from you in every other respect, so please don't send us emails, texts, and things unless you want us to read them afterwards and not read your questions at the time. So we're sort of locked into the GoToWebinar world for those things. We would really appreciate your questions. The earlier you get your questions in, the more likely it is that we'll be able to get to your questions. So today's speaker is David Craddock, and he really is one of the world's leading experts on employee share ownership schemes. He's the author of the Tolley's Guide to Employee Share Ownership, and has been a practitioner in this field for more years than I think he cares to own up to. So there he is, and how to get hold of him. The one other thing to say, because David, when he does these talks, provides an enormous amount of information on the slides. He doesn't always talk to every word that is on the slides. The slides are available for you on the website. I think they're probably already up there. So don't feel that you need to make notes and things. The slides will all be there and downloadable, or they're already there and downloadable for you. So just enjoy the webinar while you're here. If you want to watch it again in about 48 hours time, it will go up on the website, so you can actually watch the webinar again or recommend it to your friends, and your friends can watch it as well. So here is David to talk to you about employee share schemes, levelling up, and social mobility. David, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ian. It's always a great pleasure to address the Financial Services Club and the ESOP Centre. And today I'm going to be talking about the contribution that employee share schemes can make to a very topical subject, indeed, levelling up, and its associated subject, social mobility. So I'm sure that everybody who's watching this presentation is aware that levelling up was a fundamental element of the Conservative Party manifesto for the election in December 2019. And indeed, it's credited with the reason why the Conservatives were able to win previously held Labour seats in the north of England, and also previously recognised Liberal Democrat strongholds in the southwest of England. And the commitment really to levelling up was predicated upon the contention that Brexit would produce some form of financial dividend that could be ploughed into the levelling up procedure. Now, clearly, the government has been waylaid with various issues, most notably COVID in the intervening period. So it wasn't until the 2nd of February 2022 that the British government actually published its policy on levelling up through a white paper under the words moral, social, economic programme for the whole of government. So the idea there really is that the levelling up procedure is designed to address a whole range of issues within the regions that traverse a whole range of government departments, whether it be employment, business development, the economy, education, health, transport, any other aspects of the infrastructure as well. Recognise also that we're not just talking about levelling up in the urban areas, we're also talking about the rural areas and the coastal areas, an area which is very often forgotten in this levelling up agenda. And the whole thing, it is contended, is possible without actually depleting the wealth of the more prosperous areas of the country, notably the southeast of England. And therefore, it is only through economic growth that the levelling up agenda can actually be implemented and achieved in the way that it's been proposed through the white paper. Let's go to the next slide, Ian, thanks. So on this particular slide, I identified what are called the missions to level up the UK. That's a phrase taken directly from the white paper. And I'll emphasise just a couple of these. I've actually pulled out numbers 1, 6, 7, 8 and 9 for display on the slide. Number 1 is that by 2030, so that's the target date, so this has not all got to be achieved by the end of this current Parliament, but by 2030 is the target. Pay, employment and productivity will have risen in every area of the UK, with each containing a globally competitive city, with the gap between the top performing and the other areas closing. Now, the hallmark of employee share ownership, its raison d'etre, if you like, is productivity, the capacity to increase the productivity and hence the profitability of a company. I wrote a paper on that just back in October, and you'll find that on the Financial Services Club pamphleteer's blog website, where I go into enormous detail on how employee share schemes can contribute to enhanced productivity, and the evidence, in fact, the empirical evidence from both the UK and the US that support that. Note in terms of globally competitive city, well, that's very, very important, isn't it? Because, you know, so much of business in the UK gravitates to London. What we're wanting to do is emulate something that we have in the US, where, you know, we don't just have New York, we also have Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, Dallas, so many centres of business and of excellence. And that's what we're seeking to do in the UK through this levelling up agenda. I say we, I'm not aligned with any particular political party, but I am aligned with employee share ownership, and it's employee share ownership and its contribution thereto that I'm going to be talking about today. Look at number 6, mission statement number 6, that by 2030, the number of people successfully completing high quality skills training and will have significantly increased in every area of the UK. That's a direct reference to education. I remember hearing Tim Scott once, the senator for South Carolina, I believe, in the United States, saying that education is the closest thing we have to magic. So employee share ownership should be aligning itself with education. And indeed, one of the sister policies of employee share ownership is training and development, and indeed encouraging self-education as well as education. An old mentor of mine, going back decades now, he's long since passed into the other world, Jim Rowan, once said that education will make you a living, self-education will make you a fortune. And what we were seeking to do is to use employee share ownership to direct efforts into self-development, a pride and a self-responsibility in contributing to a business, because you're associated with the business, you align yourself with the business because of your alignment with the share capital through your employee share ownership. Let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Ian. So recent usages of the term, Tony Blair actually was one of the first people in the modern era to refer to the process of levelling up. And this was in the context of his preference for lower taxes to encourage social mobility. So that he was connecting levelling up with social mobility. One thing that I'm doing through this webinar. Theresa May, she referred in 1997 to levelling up in a debate on education. Okay, and at various times during her time as Prime Minister, she referred to the British dream, a clear attempt to imitate the concept of the American dream in UK society. More of that in a few minutes. Boris Johnson then, of course, made reference to levelling up big time in the Conservative Party manifesto, where he says to use this investment prudently and strategically to level up every part of the United Kingdom while strengthening the ties that bind it together. So strengthening the regions, but then binding together the United Kingdom as a whole, a clear reference to wanting to avoid the breakup of the United Kingdom. Justine Greening, worth a mention, she's written lots of very, very interesting material on this. She's no longer a member of Parliament. She was the member for Putney from 2005 to 2019, but she connects levelling up with social mobility. Now, why have I brought in levelling up and social mobility for a talk on employee share schemes? Well, the way I see it is this, that employee share scheme, this is a key principle I want to share with you. Employee share schemes contribute to social mobility. It puts money in the hands of people earlier on in life to get onto the housing ladder, to develop education programs. In all sorts of ways, it contributes to social mobility. And then, of course, once you've got the individual focused on their development, they can better contribute to the community as a whole. Hence the connection between the individual approach to social mobility and the communal approach to levelling up. A socially mobile person, a person confident in their skills, confident in their development, is better able to contribute to that levelling up of society and indeed contribute to the community in which they live. So let's go to the next slide. Let's just have a word about why there is a need for this levelling up. Many reasons. When I was researching this, and by the way, I've been researching this subject for the best part of 4 or 5 years, long before it even got into the Conservative Party manifesto. But 5 key reasons are picked out as to why the need for levelling up is arisen. One is deindustrialisation, which of course is characteristic of the north of England, once the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. Now, of course, in many ways in disrepair and very much in need of inward investment. Globalization of world markets, which without any effective tariff protection policy has had the effect of exposing staple British industries to low-cost overseas competition and contributed to undermining wages in the labour market and indeed contributed to the loss of jobs. So we might think of the shipbuilding industry in Scotland and in the northeast of England. We might think of ceramics in Stoke-on-Trent. We might think of the textile industries in Lancashire and Yorkshire, the glass industries in that part of the world as well. All sorts of industries being subject to the deleterious effects of globalization. Centralization, you know, we think about the north of England as where the Industrial Revolution began, but these days, of course, there's a centralization of business decisions in the city of London at the expense of developing equally competitive centres in the regions. One of the big advantages of the United States is that they have 50 states. Each has its own capital, a business centre of excellence. They have 50 ways of finding out how to get it right, okay? We don't really quite have that in the UK, and that's what we need to emulate. Secularisation, I think back to my own background, actually, and for my personal development, education was absolutely crucial. My parents were committed to that. One of my father's businesses was actually seeking to provide school furniture for the newly sprouting schools in the region and beyond. Also home life, encouragement from parents at home, and also faith. Faith played a very important part in my development from my parents, my grandmother, the local church, the local youth fellowship. Where I learned confidence that comes through faith in a higher being. So the secularisation of society has contributed to that undermining of confidence, is the point that I'm making there, particularly in the younger generation. And then, of course, tied in really with this deindustrialisation point, the decline and decay of local infrastructure. And therefore, it's no accident that the levelling up agenda includes an emphasis on transport, notably rail, which took a severe blow back in the 60s through the implementation of the Vichy proposals, which took out all those wonderful link lines or link loops, whatever they were called, depending on where you lived. So the desperate need for private investment into the region, whether it be direct of its own accord or in link with some sort of public-private investment partnership. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the American Dream, I referred to this, and I've provided quite a lot of information on the slide about the American Dream. It really emanates from the 1776 Declaration of of independence. And the thinking goes something like this. We all have inherent rights. Those inherent rights, according to the thinking around the American dream, is that they are given by God. And what are those inherent rights? Those inherent rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So because they're given by God rather than given by government, that's the distinction there. They're given by God. Can you see where the confidence comes from? You've got them anyway. Nobody has to give them to you. So because they're given by God, the only limits are the limits that you place on yourself, and that is the American dream. And therefore choose not to put limits on yourself and believe that absolutely anything is possible. That in essence is the American dream. And it was first described as such, not back in the 18th century, although it derives from that Declaration of Independence, but by a historian called James Truslow Adams, who in 1931 wrote a fascinating book called The Epic of America, talking about the land in which life should be better and richer and fuller in every respect, okay? Not just in material, but in relationships, in spiritual and in emotional well-being, with the opportunity for everybody to fulfill themselves and that according to their ability and their achievement. The point is that it's grounded on an equality of opportunity, not necessarily an equality of outcomes, okay? But an equality of opportunity. So can there be a British dream is the question. Can there be a British dream? And if so, can it achieve upward mobility? Well, what can we learn from America? Look, you know, still back on that previous slide still back on the previous slide, yeah, okay. The most successful nation ever in the history of humanity. There might be a few lessons we can learn from them. They're not an imperialist power, but they have this American dream. And it's all based upon aspiration and fulfilling potential and achieving fulfillment. Yeah, and the founding fathers didn't see it as something that they would impose on other nations, but something which they would show by example. Yeah, so America's not an imperialist power; it doesn't impose. That would be contrary to the principles of independence and self-determination upon which it was built. You know, thinking of Cicero and de Tocqueville and J.S. Mill, all those wonderful philosophers. But it is intended to the founding fathers to provide an example. The American experiment is designed to provide an example, and that's why Theresa May was quite right when she talked about the British dream. Let's go to the next slide. So clearly, there is a path for the British dream. It's through the channels of education primarily, but employee share schemes can complement those channels through education and provide channels through business. And then when you can marry the channels through business through the alignment with the share capital of the company, feeling associated with the business, united around the totem of the developing share value, when you can marry those channels through the company, through business, with the channels through education and provide training and development, you've got a very, very powerful mix. And that's what I contend can be constituted as the British dream, and to which the subject of employee share schemes can provide a fundamental contribution. There are, of course, some very distinct differences between Britain and the US. In Britain, we think in terms of government bestowing rights, whereas I've already talked about the American dream, where US concept through the American dream is for God to provide those rights. If God gives them, they can't be taken away, is the thinking around the American dream. Remember also that American society is built on building upwards from the Americans coming into the economy and building from the ground right up to the top. In the UK, of course, we have the history of feudalism. That's really gone these days, isn't it? A few vestiges around the place, but it did hamper the development of employee ownership in the early days. And therefore, it's no accident that the powerful trend for employee ownership began in the US, in California, Palo Alto, through Louis Kelso, working with Peninsula newspapers, his client, 1956. We didn't really get going until 1978, which happens to be the year my career after university started. So the whole of my career has actually tracked the development of this wonderful subject that we call employee share schemes. And so I've identified also how, with the immigrants coming into America and ultimately taking up the land and more land being taken up by immigrants, but the immigrants still coming, rather than fall out, they had to share. Yeah, and so that's another contributory factor as to why employee ownership developed much more powerfully earlier in the US than it did in the UK. Rather than fight over the land, they shared the land, and so developed farm working cooperative type arrangements. And so I've identified this key principle at the bottom of this slide for employee share ownership linked to social mobility: working together, sharing rewards for employee share ownership, and also the sister policy of profit sharing, central to the American dream and should be central to the British dream. And we were able to create a leverage through shared working to assist the upward mobility. So if you've got employee share ownership contributing to social mobility, and everybody is involved in that process, well, that creates a critical mass of people achieving social mobility and contributing to that communal levelling up. I've included this example of Jonathan Livingston Seagull, wonderful story, published in 1970. It's a story by the American author Richard Bach. It's about Jonathan, who was a seagull, and he got tired of seeing his fellow seagulls scrapping for food, and he thought it was a pretty paltry way of life. And so he aspired, and he developed more and more refined and better and more dynamic ways of flying, because that's what seagulls can do if they apply themselves to it, rather than scrapping around on the ground for food. And so Jonathan develops this flying to a high precision. It becomes respected by the other gulls. He seeks out mentors to teach him how to fly better. And so he in turn becomes a teacher to teach others how to fly. Can you see how his social mobility contributed to enabling the community to level up as he shared his skills with other people? And so ultimately becomes described as pretty well a 1 in a million bird. Yeah, isn't that beautiful? Let's go to the next slide. This is a few lessons we learned from Jonathan. Jonathan takes personal responsibility for his future. But if we're involved in employee share schemes, okay, we want to take responsibility. We want to take responsibility in our companies, because by so doing, it contributes to the development of the share value. Yeah, we take personal responsibility for our future through that development of wealth and indeed the upward mobility. Jonathan pursues that combination of education and self-education. Remember what I said about employee share schemes? One of its key sister policies is an emphasis on training and development. And Jonathan chooses to contribute to the society from which he has come. Important point to recognize there that yes, you achieve your social mobility, that makes you more equipped to contribute to civic society, whether it be through standing for election, maybe, to a body of government, whether it be at local level or national level, or indeed contributing to self-help groups or sustainability projects, local health partnerships, whatever it might be. Let's go to the next slide. Contribution to social mobility. I've re-emphasized the principle there. You can read that at your leisure. Let's go to the next slide. Next slide, Ian. Thank you. So, few key points to emphasize. Employee share schemes, when you implement them properly with strong communication, they develop that incentive entrepreneurial culture. That's what you want. You want people in your company to be motivated as an entrepreneur would be motivated. So it's conducive to personal development of the individual, but also the corporate development of the business. Value creation based on productivity, achieved before the reward is dispensed. So it's non-inflationary. You're only going to actually dispense the rewards once the productivity is being given. That's a principle which we can superimpose on a macro context for the economy as a whole. If indeed the Chancellor got hold of that principle, and to some degree he is, and previous chancellors have to some degree done so. They've all embraced employee share ownership ever since 1978, when the first profit sharing employee share scheme was introduced. Employee share schemes create a victory mentality rather than a victim mentality, as employees know that they are receiving a fair reward. Employee share schemes deliver more substantial funds to employees earlier in their career, so they contribute to social mobility through earlier house purchase, family development and domestic harmony. Employee share schemes contribute to domestic cohesion as employees develop that mindset of personal responsibility, not just to their family, but to the wider domain of the company and indeed to civic society. And employee share schemes develop that sense of co-partnership in the company that encourages the inquiring mind, that's conducive to the learning and self-education and personal development. Let's go to the next slide. Just a few more principles I want to emphasize. These are all the sister policies that help employee share ownership to work in a company. I've identified education, development and training leading to qualifications. You know, you've got to get people into that route which enables them to aspire, into that channel which enables them to progress. I've talked about these sister policies in other of my webinars, but there's a summary for you to look at your own leisure. Most importantly, of course, it includes devolved decision taking. Let's go to the next slide. So right here we have the government base. How do we encourage, or how does government encourage employee share schemes? How does it encourage contribution to the wider community? Well, always really through the corporation tax deduction. That's the way to encourage more and more employee share schemes within a company. And indeed, I would suggest, which hasn't happened so far, to introduce the sister policies of training and development. I suggest that wherever training and development is introduced, that there is an additional corporation tax deduction. And indeed, I would also encourage a corporation tax deduction to a company to encourage its employees to be involved in the wider community. Clearly, metrics and measurements have to be developed in order to substantiate that, but that is my suggestion. And then we have section 172. Let's go to the next slide where I talk a little bit about section 172. Section 172 is derived from the Companies Act 2006, the duty to promote the success of the company. Now note that includes for the first time in 2006 legislation, the impact on the company's operations on the community and the environment. Is that policed in any way? Is it monitored in any way? Is it specifically or purposely encouraged in any way? I would suggest not, and that's something that the government needs to get its head around if it's going to properly pursue this levelling up agenda. Let's go to the next slide. So here we have what I call a summary of the idea of the employee-owned company as a community company. So I'm talking here about a private company, a normal private company, shares owned by shareholders and employees, and this is my thesis. The employees identify with the company through the employee share schemes. The company identifies with the community because it's part of the community. Therefore, the employees identify with the community through accepting those local civic responsibilities, contributing to the self-help and local community groups, and participating in health and other local cooperatives, and engaging in local environmental groups. And that's a particular line of policy which a company has to adopt. How do we encourage it? As we've always encouraged it, through the tax bait of corporation tax deduction. Tax bait always attracts the interest of companies and their advisors. Once they've been attracted to it, they can see the wider commercial benefits for their employees, for their company, and for the community. Let's go to this next slide, where I've made reference to social enterprises. These are different from private companies, but it's a principle which increasingly is gaining interest, and I would posit the belief that it should be part of that levelling up agenda, where the social enterprise really doesn't have normal shareholders. It has sort of stakeholders and community type interests, primarily activated through involvement in the ownership of the company by a trust. A very powerful concept, and it can easily sit alongside the encouragement of social enterprises, can easily sit alongside the development of private companies with employees as shareholders, as well as the majority shareholders contributing to their own social mobility, the levelling up of the community, and of course the success of their company. Now these final slides, I've shared these slides before, and I would just suggest that you read them at your leisure. These are all the wonderful characteristics of employee share ownership. Number one, it redistributes wealth. Number two, it encourages productivity. Next slide, please. Number three, it provides incentive. Number four, it's individualist, but number five, as well as delivering individual reward, it contributes to the collectivist benefit of the company as a whole, and I would suggest, as part of this levelling up idea, to the community as a whole. It's educative. It guides people into education. Remember, the closest thing we have to magic, education. And then we come to the last slide, number 7 and number 8, two additional characteristics of employee share schemes. International. It has an international dimension. We've not really talked about that today. It's not really relevant to this talk, but we have talked about it in previous webinars that I've been invited to lead, notably in relation to the development of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the achievement thereof. And then, of course, it's voluntary. You're not forcing people, but you're encouraging people. And that involves the company explaining to them the benefits and the merits of employee share ownership. And then now this next slide, which is Next slide, yes. Just a summary position, encouraging the rewards and the instincts towards social mobility through employee share ownership. And then 2, using the tax bait as the initiative from the British government. They're the 2 key principles. And I've said here, any further assistance, do feel free to contact me. All my details are on the next slide. And we've just completed the show at 16:30 precisely, Ian. How about that? Tour de force.
Just about made it. Well, it wasn't tour de force, David. Thank you. I'm the one who's supposed to say tour de force, not you. That was a tour de force, David. Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, well done.
That was terrific. It's a real whistle-stop tour through that line of thinking. There's a lot of deep thought that's gone in there, and I would encourage people, if you want to think about it some more, to read those slides through again, maybe even watch the webinar again if you like watching things again. And I would also commend to you an ESOP Centre publication which came out last month, Why Employee Share Ownership Matters, by my colleagues Professor Michael Mainelli and Simon Mills, which covers some of these areas around social mobility, and also does cover a little bit more around the sustainable goals, which David pointed out at the end. That wasn't the purpose of this talk, but if that is the area that interests you, there's a lot more material in that publication for you. That is also up on the Xian ESOP Centre website, as are the slides from this. If you go to the events bit, you can see the slides. If you go to the words bit, you can see this as I think the second or third most recent report. Questions? They've been flooding in actually, so right. I will do my best to
bring them on in.
These questions. I'm going to start with one from Matthew or Matt Bradbury, which was the first one that came in. With the cost of living crisis in full sway, how is levelling up being affected, and what are the areas that you feel are most affected? And I'm going to suggest in the context of employee share ownership.
Well, it makes the levelling up agenda so much more difficult, doesn't it? Of course it does. It means that people are levelling down more before they can be levelled up. The subject of this talk is how can employee share schemes contribute to that levelling up agenda at any level. At any level, if a business is established in a particular market, and that market is vibrant, then that company properly managed will have the opportunity to develop wealth, and employees will have the opportunity to share in that wealth if they're members of an employee share scheme. Now, one idea that I put forward in another context, in another forum, to help people during the cost of living crisis, is to work with the sister policy of profit sharing. Yes, great to be an employee share scheme for the long-term development of the share capital, but the sister policy of profit sharing is very, very powerful mechanism indeed, and that's another area in which I specialise. I'm introduced profit sharing arrangements all over the world. But one of the ways in which profit sharing can assist during this time of a cost of living crisis is to pay the profit sharing early. So rather than pay the whole of the profit share at the end of the year, which is what normally happens once the year has been completed, pay, let's say, on a quarterly basis, depending upon the achievement within each quarter. Okay, and also if the employees have got shares rather than share options, potentially pay dividends on a quarterly basis rather than dividends on a half-yearly or an annual basis. So that's a concrete and practical policy that can help with the cost of living crisis at this particular time.
Those are very interesting thoughts, and it preempted one of the questions I had in my back pocket about profit sharing and bonuses, which is something we discussed before. But it's a very good answer, I think, to Matt's question, and I don't need questions in my back pocket because we've got so many that have come in from the audience. Susan says that it's a great presentation, which I would agree. She asked a few questions, one or two of which I think really have been answered in the talk, but here's one that hasn't. What type of employee share scheme works best for levelling up?
Yeah, good question. I would suggest firstly that you need to look at the company, that you can't just do a stick on. You can't just do a template. You've got to think about the particular needs of the company. Remember, we're talking about leveling up in different regions. We're talking about primarily industrial regions in the north, down in the southwest. We're talking about primarily agricultural. We're also talking about coastal as well, with the old seaside resorts of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s laying to waste in many ways. So look at the particular need of the particular company in the particular area. So we can't always say this template works everywhere. But what I would say is, really partly reiterating how I answered Matt's question, that getting shares into the hands of people earlier, so you can deliver dividends earlier, I think that's a key benefit. But very important, don't lose sight of the longer term development. So it's a question of marrying together the short-term need and the long-term need. And it's actually as it happens, that same principle. Profit share delivers shorter-term reward. Employee share schemes deliver longer-term reward and develop the retention of the employees. Yeah. And those two combined are a very, very powerful combination in any company, anywhere. And I've introduced them in many, many companies all over the world.
That's really helpful. We have an interest.
I'd also say that longer term scheme doesn't necessarily have to be ownership at the outset. It could be option to produce ownership later. Often, of course, really again during this cost of living crisis, gifting of shares. Okay, so it might be that you give your profit share in the form of shares. Okay, so it becomes a gifting of shares. But typically in this cost of living crisis, people do want cash, so maybe you have your profit share, part shares, part cash.
Yeah,
give the flavour anyway of an answer.
It's a cost of living crisis. It's also can be a squeeze on profits for the companies. So you have to find that balance. Yeah. In what you're doing if you want your company to be.
It's finding a balance and also buying people into what the company is about. Communication is of the essence, explaining to them the state of the company, bringing them to understand that this company does have potential. It might just be going through a rough period at the moment. So it's always, coping with downturns in the economy. It's important to communicate just as much as it is when you're in a boom.
We have a delicious sort of I won't say left field question, more like a red team question from Laurie, who has spotted that you are a bit of an evangelist for employee share schemes. I don't know how she could have spotted this, but she asks, to provide a balanced view, what would you say are the potential negatives or pitfalls of employee share ownership, and how do we avoid those?
Well, the pitfalls, yes. I mean, you've got to be realistic about expectations. I think that's the crucial point. When you're actually communicating the introduction of the scheme arrangement, you've got to be very, very realistic about the growth of the company. So if an individual is of the belief that, then they're going to become a 10 times fold millionaire through a stake in the company, which is currently worth, let's say, $500,000 and only has the capacity over the next 10 years to rise to probably 10 million as a total, they're going to be deluded. But sometimes I have come across cases like that where the founders, completely misguided, sought to actually communicate to key employees that there was a capacity for them to earn significantly more from involvement in employee share schemes that was actually possible on even the wildest projections. So that's very, very important indeed. Another pitfall is to manage expectations on contribution to management. So management has to be looking to reinforce the employee share scheme with the sister policies, some of which are decision taking. But then it needs to manage that devolved decision taking, and it needs to educate people who are going to be given those decision-making powers. So it's always a question really of seeking to understand your people, seeking to be honest with them, and seeking the development of the individuals as a whole, rather than just focusing on the share scheme. Another downfall is I'm really just trying to emphasize things that can go wrong. If people are sort of focusing on the calculation of the share value all the time, we had a client company like this. It was a good company. Ultimately, it sold at a good price, But it really was time for it to sell, because the employees were becoming distracted by continually wanting to calculate what the share price was and pestering management for information to enable them to do this. And that is a distraction. That is a massive, massive distraction. You've got to focus on the wealth creation. You've got to focus on the underlying principles of being in a company where you've been given a share of the share capital. Feel great about that and do your absolute hardest to develop the company, and listen very carefully to the communications which management share with you. Should be on a regular basis, at least quarterly, about how the profit loss account for the year is developing and how indeed the balance sheet and the overall wealth of the company is developing. Does that help you? But yeah, yes, I agree with you. I am, as you call it, an evangelist for the subject, and
that's my expression, not Laurie's, I have to say.
It is a very, very powerful, very, very powerful management tool.
Yeah, that's a good answer. Now we've got a couple of sort of slightly left field questions. Matt has a follow-up question around sustainable energy. Do we need to level up sustainable energy in the UK? Investing in technology and business around sustainable energy, and perhaps if you can link that thought to employee share schemes.
Well, there does, and there has to be a balance. I think a rush to renewable energies, as we call them, a rush to renewable energies at the expense of traditional energies is a recipe for disaster, and indeed a contribution, Matt, to what you were referring to earlier, the cost of living crisis. So there's got to be a balance, but clearly there is an opportunity for a country in the West, and I would suggest my own country of the United Kingdom, to actually take a lead on the development of renewable energies rather than relying upon China. And to become an export master, to be export to the rest of the world, development of renewable energies. We are renowned as a country for our ingenuity, for our initiative, for our invention. The three I's there. And indeed, we're better placed to site those renewable energy manufacturing plants than in the levelling up areas, and to bring people into employee share schemes to motivate them to develop those companies. But there's also a more subtle point, Matt and Ian, which is this: that employee share schemes encourages personal responsibility. Okay, properly communicated, properly understood by the management of the companies when they introduce the schemes, it encourages personal responsibility. And clearly, that sense of personal responsibility must extend to everything else. Looking after your health, looking after the environment. And indeed, a contribution to both those, health and environment, is the development of renewable energy. So hopefully that gives you a flavour of an answer.
Thanks. And another left field question. This is one of Susan's follow-up questions. Again, see if you can link this question to employee share ownership. Are free ports a good idea? Right. Okay. In the main, I have been supportive of free ports. I know it's a controversial subject, and I'm aware of that. I'm aware that there are pros and cons. I'm aware that it can take resources out of other areas and put them into the deprived areas. But there are notable examples of free ports already in the United Kingdom, particularly up in the Tees area. Very, very powerful example indeed. And I do think that it's necessary for the deprived areas to be given those tax advantages or tax immunities in order to rise up like Jonathan Livingston Seagull, yes, out of that dull and drab world into something which is really creative. I mean, look, we have an enormous task on our hands in the United Kingdom. I don't think we should be scant at all in what we say about that. It is an enormous task to level up these areas. And my hometown, where I originally came from, I currently I've lived in the Staffordshire Moors for the last 31 years, but originally I came from Stoke-on-Trent, and I looked there at what happened to the ceramic industry, and I would dearly, dearly love to see it resurrected and brought back to life. And little by little it is. There's private investment, there's public investment, but the fact of the matter is, tax baits. I mean, free ports is tax baits on an enormous scale, right? Tax baits will always attract interest, and so you attract the interest, and then you forward plan your initiatives, and with that, of course, becomes the commercial benefits of the people and the resources which have been attracted because of the tax baits. And in the case of the subject which Susan alludes to,
the tax baits associated with the free ports.
Okay, David, thanks very much for that. We are out of time, so it really is just down to me to say a few thanks to people. The first vote of thanks that I want to give is to the members and sponsors of the FS Club and the ESOP Centre. Once again, all of these organisations have been so helpful to us in joining and sponsoring what we do. We couldn't do what we're doing without them. It really is as simple as that. Also to let you know, there is a wealth of resource on the website about this sort of thing. I would commend to you Newspad, the ESOP Centre website, FS Club bulletins on this topic and many other topics, as indeed is our webinar program. The second vote of thanks is to you, the audience, for listening and for staying with us. We have a few more events before the seasonal lull. So on Monday, the curious economics of authenticity and data everywhere. You've got two to choose from on Monday, or if you're feeling like luxuriating in Zen webinars, come to both. On Tuesday, Malaysia's economic transition, very interesting topic if international is your thing. Wednesday, cash is not the horse cart of payments, it's the public bicycle. And on Monday, the following week, can you really measure corporate culture? That should be a very interesting webinar as well. The final thank you, of course, is to David. Those of you who are aficionados of these might have noticed actually that I'm not in my usual location. I'm broadcasting from or narrowcasting from a secret location in West London, although you wouldn't need to do very much detective work to work out where that secret location might be. I have a shortage of musical instruments here, and I have been using musical instruments to make the round of applause. Juliet, who organises the ESOP Centre, wanted me to go out and buy some sleigh bells today to give it, I think, a seasonal feel. I didn't have either the time or the financial inclination, as I haven't been levelled up lately, to go and buy some sleigh bells, but I can give you a little bit of a sleigh bell noise, which I hope you can hear when I broadcast it from here. To say thank you. So from me and David anyway, best wishes of the season. Thank you everybody. David, thanks once again, and goodbye.